Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Saldaña, and this is the National Education Policy Center's Talks Education podcast. On this month's podcast, I spoke with Drs. Paula Arce-Trigatti and Caitlin Farrell about research practice partnerships. Dr. Arce-Trigatti is the director of the National Network of Research Practice Partnerships, NARP, a professional learning community for research practice partnerships in education housed at the Kinder Institute at Rice University. Dr. Farrell is an associate research professor at the University of Colorado Boulder and the director of the National Center for Research and Policy and Practice, which examines where and how school and district leaders engage with research evidence as a part of their work and works to think about strategies for supporting the use of research in education. In this month's podcast, Dr. Arce-Trigatti and Farrell walk us through some of the core components of research practice partnerships and discuss how the research goals, design, and partnerships look different across research contexts. So, for listeners who may not be familiar with the term research practice partnerships, what are some of the defining characteristics of research practice partnerships, and how might they differ from traditional researcher practitioner collaborations?
Well, I'm looking at my colleague Caitlin here because here at NERP, we like to start with the definition from the 2021 William T. Grant white paper that my colleague and friend Caitlin is the lead author on. So, Caitlin, why don't you share a little bit about that definition, and I can share a little bit about how we play with that definition in our space over here.
Well, so as Paula mentioned, in 2021, the William T. Grant Foundation and Spencer Foundation supported my colleagues and myself to do a scan of the field of research practice partnerships, the growing field, the evolving field of research practice partnerships. There had been an original definition in 2013, so it was about 10 years later or so. And the field really, or the research practice partnerships really have become, with attention and funding, part of this ecosystem that is connecting research practice and policy together. So we offer in the white paper an updated definition of an RPP specifically in education and from the US context. And there's a couple of what I think of as key or central DNA. So research practice partnerships can take all different kinds of approaches and have different combinations of people together, but this is the essential DNA that would kind of unify. So first, they are long-term collaborations. So unlike an individual research grant, which might be for a year or two, these are partnerships that are extending for 2, 3, or more. So this is an open-ended commitment that the partners are having together as the collaborative work evolves. The second is that research practice partnerships work toward educational improvement or equitable transformation. Different partnerships define their goals differently in different ways. But broadly speaking, that there is this focus on pressing needs and challenges or leveraging the strengths of communities in a local space. So whereas you could have a traditional research project that is trying to build theory or test hypotheses really for the research communities, which is all fine and well, here you really have a centering of the needs of students, families, educators, and communities. The third element of that DNA is that there's an engagement with research, and that's a leading activity. So you might have other kinds of partnerships. Districts have all kinds of different partnerships with service providers or for professional development or all different outside organizations. But here, engagement with research is a leading activity. Now, what that looks like can really range, whether that's partners are there's an initial question, then the research partners and practice partners go off and kind of do some things separately and then come back and engage together around initial findings, or whether you have a lot of blurring of lines between practice and research where you can't really tell who is the researcher and who is the practice side or the community side member, or folks are engaging in improvement science ideas to test different change ideas that were rooted in research. It can look lots of different ways, but that you do have this imprint of research on the work together. And then the fourth principle is related to how the RPPs are organized. So again, it can be very diverse, different ways of how groups are coming together or individuals and their organizations are coming together. but a shared commitment is that you are bringing together the diversity of expertise needed for the local issue at hand. And so you might be bringing from education, you might be bringing district leaders who understand what happens in school systems and what the conditions in classrooms are. And then you might be bringing community members who understand the deep local context. And to that, you're bringing folks in a university setting who bring a lot of computer science expertise. And so then together, that is a team which is bringing a diverse set of perspectives that would help you be able to try and make some progress on this question of computer science, expanding computer science access within a particular community, if that is your question. And then finally, the RPPs are really trying to develop and engage in strategies that are shifting the power relations in research endeavors. And so there's in like more traditional research, there's some pretty baked in assumptions on and imbalances of power in terms of the researchers really defining the focus of the research, not necessarily having any opportunities for participants to have a say in the purpose or what the methods might be. And they become subjects whose sort of data or information is extracted. And then findings are created, and those ideas really stay within the research community. And so here in a partnership, you're really trying to actually shift some of those dynamics so that you are collaboratively defining your goals together. You're setting direction together. You are working on a research agenda together. And then into the research project, how the data are collected, managed, used, who's making decisions, where and how those findings are being shared more broadly. All of those are different checkpoints along the way in like the broader research process, where it's not just within, the PI of a research team who's making those decisions, but it's actually up for negotiation across. And again, different partnerships handle those differently, but it is a defining feature.
What I would say that, or typically when folks ask me that question, it's always kind of like, it's easier to say what is not an RPP than what is an RPP. Because as the core DNA that Caitlin went through, as you'll hear in that, it can vary quite substantially across partnerships. So like, as I mentioned, we have 70 plus members within NERP. Every single one of them is different. Every single one of them. There are principles that you can see, as Caitlin's saying, that are taken up in each one, and that's what brings the connections across. But I always, another kind of thing I always like to say is when we think of kind of the phrase, RPPs do this, XYZ, I'm always like, no, full stop. No, we cannot say that. Some RPPs might do the thing, but some might not. And it's not up to us to figure that out because they are entirely reflective of their local context. So another way to think about the principles that Caitlin shared is if anybody's listening, if you play like PlayStation, like FIFA, so I'm a big soccer fan. But so like in FIFA, you have the different soccer players, right? They each have like a profile and they have different strengths and abilities kind of highlighted, right? So each player, if you pick a player for your team, they'll give you like numbers around like how good are they defensively, how good are they dribbling, how good are they shooting, blah, blah, blah. So RPP, similarly, you could draw like a profile like that based on the core DNA that Caitlin just said, right? Not that we do this, but a partnership could sit down and say, okay, in terms of long-term, what does that even mean for us? Let's put a range down. Like is long-term 3 years? Is it 5 years? Is it forever? There's no end date, right? A second one that Caitlin mentioned is around diversity of expertise, right? How diverse is diverse? What does that mean? Let's put some kind of boundaries down on what that means and what that looks like for our work. And so you can imagine doing that for each of those core DNA that Caitlin said, and you can build out a profile for each RPP, and you'll see that they are different based on all of those things. And again, I'm going to reiterate my soapbox moment, but as they should be, because they are reflective of their local context. So they are unique to the people, the challenges, the opportunities that are in that community.
So both of you have already painted this picture where RPPs involve a lot of people, and they're all going to be unique in the sense that communities differ, context differs, history differs. So my next question is about power and voice. Caitlin, you started to mention some of this. As individuals within an RPP, speak to the goals of it. And Paula, you mentioned this, right? There's some decisions that need to be made. What do we know about both the challenges that arise in that process and how RPPs and the folks within them have successfully kind of maneuvered some of those tensions?
To build off of what Paula was saying, the question of where and how an individual partnership thinks about or embeds commitment to equity, diversity, inclusion as a part of their work. I would say when we're coming up with definition, part of our task was to come up with a language that was broad enough for this really diverse community. And so then how individual members or groups of members or different communities under this broader umbrella of research practice partnerships see or handle or talk about or think about power dynamics and pushing on power dynamics, can look really quite different. So I would say like a collective, kind of connective tissue is that research practice partnerships are taking a step in that direction and thinking about more equitable ways in terms of like the process of partnering or the process, some of those research processes. But we did, Paula and I collaborated on a project where we got to speak with members of over 65 different research practice partnerships nationwide. And some spoke when we asked them about what does equity look like in terms of your partnership, they would say, oh, well, it's because of the outcomes. Like we're focused on the reclassification rates for English learners in differentiated instructional settings. So like we are pursuing equity and a diversity agenda as a part of the sort of the focus, the outcomes related there. Others talked about equity in terms of really understanding their partnership embedded within particular local systems that were recreating or reproducing inequalities. And so some of these folks really centered community needs, really trying to understand the history of those local settings, centering the roles for community members, or those whose voices may have been more marginalized in the past in order to disrupt some of those broader systems. So there's, again, just really different ways that different partnerships might take that up in the course of their work. And it definitely matters because it is connected back to the goals that they're advancing, who they then decide is important to have around the table, the ways in which they're doing their work, the kinds of outcomes they're hoping to work toward, and the kinds of changes they might be looking to see as a result or as related to their work together.
The only thing I would add is, or even just simplify, Caitlin, your message, I would just say it's the who, the how, and the what. That's really how partnerships talk about a lot of their equity and power goals that they might have, right? Who is involved in the partnership? You can really be very intentional about who is coming to participate and consider power dynamics in that respect. How are they coming together to participate, right? What does the joint work actually look like? Where is it taking place? Like, is it in a neutral location? Is it in a place where the disruption of power can actually be emphasized, right? And then the what, and you heard Caitlin talk about that. There's differences around how partnerships conceptualize the goals that they're working towards. So the what in and of itself. I think one challenge that I would layer onto all of this is the political environment that all of these partnerships exist in. So, that's sort of another kind of turn it up, turn it down element to partnership work is to what extent, even though people within the partnership might very much embrace all kinds of equity and power dynamic kind of issues, the context in which they're in may actually act as a prohibitive barrier to the pursuit of some of those goals, right? Especially if you're in sort of more politically spicy areas where you really have to watch out and you can't even use words like equity, for example. So this is why it's again, I go back to something I said earlier. It's like to the extent to which partnerships take up any of these things are going to be a reflection of their context. So to really understand why they look the way they do, you have to go in there and understand where they're operating from.
I feel like we could just have a conversation about the politics that exists around RPPs and how that's changing how practitioners and researchers even talk about their work. But I want to ask you about outcomes. So you've both already touched on the fact that most RPPs, all RPPs, have goals. Paul, I'm already learning from you. I won't say how do RPPs do this. I'm going to ask how have you observed RPP stakeholders do this work in terms of translating findings into change, whether that's policy change, practice change, maybe some political change. How have you all, in your partnerships and in your work with RPPs, found that RPP stakeholders have engaged in that work?
So this question, this word translation is an interesting one that you chose. To me, it makes me think of actually probably not a word that we would use in RPP land, because translation in some ways implies that there's a product that is done that I now need to change for a different audience. And it's sort of this kind of one-way transmission of knowledge image that I'm getting in my mind. And that's actually counter to all the things that we would imagine an RPP to do. So although I think some element of translation might be happening, that's not a key feature. That's not exactly how I would argue that change ends up happening with respect to research and evidence in RPPs. So you're going to get tired of me hearing me say this, but again, it matters what the RPP is working on and what kinds of research are they doing, for example. So you can imagine if there's a partnership that's working on like co-design, right, of a curriculum, for example, right, there's no research translation there because there's a really kind of a blurring of boundaries between a research side person and a practice side person. They're in each other's lanes and they're working together to co-create something, right? So that kind of uptake of research is happening in the moment and in real time. You can imagine a different partnership that might be more policy oriented, right? And so you can imagine a university-based researcher, let's say, and a researcher working in a district office. There again, I would argue there's no translation because what's happening there is oftentimes it's a PhD talking to a PhD. It's just that their organizational setting differs. And so they're working closely together on whatever the research might be, right? And it's really more about now supporting the district leader in spreading of the knowledge. So instead of translation, a phrase that we use in RPP land is knowledge mobilization. So how does knowledge mobilization occur with respect to partnership folks that are not core to the work? Because that's really what ends up happening, right? If you're in the RPP, like if you're in that 2 to 3 core person team, like you know what's coming down the pike. You've been being updated all the time. You're influencing each other's thoughts, right? And you're in each other's spaces. So there's not necessarily like, and now we stop and now we translate, right? And I'm not saying that you were saying this. I'm just saying that's what that word implies, right? It's a similar word, and I'm just going to say this here, so it's recorded for all eternity. Dissemination is also not a word that we like to use in RPP land because dissemination, again, also implies a sort of one way, I'm going to shout it from the rooftops, everybody please listen to me, I have something important to say. And although it might have a place beyond the confines of the RPP, what we prefer to think of is the word engagement. So how do we support people to engage with the research and evidence that's being co-produced in the partnership? So those are a few thoughts. Caitlin, come on in. What do you think? What do you see from where you sit?
Again, I'm in this more traditional researcher type space and having, have sort of studied research use by district leaders, by educators, have sat. So from studies of research use, I think we have a better idea or a different idea. I think the current research and design typical traditional infrastructure is research gets produced, it gets disseminated, and we hope one day it makes its hands into leaders and then they'll have some magical decision that they need to make and there'll be this like perfect alignment of here was this piece of research that I accessed right at the right moment. I needed to make this particular kind of decision. So that's very much from it's a one-way model. We have a lot of infrastructure. It's what most of the PhD, like most research training supports you to kind of do. Our work has been really focused on, actually, let's go to the end user. let's go to the district leader. Let's go to district leaders who sit in in the central office. What does their day-to-day work look like? What are the range of things they're juggling and balancing and forms of information that they're coming at them in a million different ways, and the nature of the conversations they're having individually and at their department meetings and in different task force meetings? And how does decision-making unfold over this course of 18-month period where little tiny, momentary decisions are settled, but then they open up when they go to a new meeting and they get unsettled and new ideas come in. And you see that really research is, well, first of all, it's just one piece of information, maybe, that folks are engaged with. They're looking at their local data. They're looking at the politics of who's in the room or the broader community. There's a history to that issue. There's content knowledge that's relevant. There's a whole host of things that are part of decision-making happening in districts or in schools, of which research might be a piece of it. And it's also, if you take that as your starting place of like, okay, well, this is actually what decision-making looks like. This is how, leaders are planning professional development or creating new assessments or choosing curricular materials. Then you also see the ways in which partnerships with researchers, if they're stretching, across that 18-month period, because you're working on something that's relevant to one of the issues for you as a leader at hand, you're going to be able to bring in those ideas in a more regular way. And it's going to be relevant. It'll probably be more timely. It'll probably be more useful to your particular issues at hand. So, it's, I'm not at all, and I think we can probably talk about this is not, research practice partnerships are the silver bullet for all issues everywhere in education and everyone should be doing them all the time. I don't think Paula or I would say that. But that, that kind of being put to the side, our current infrastructure for research to inform policy and practice is not really aligned with the multifaceted practice of district leaders, school leaders, policy leaders. And I think it would be, if we actually sort of could imagine and envision together, what would it mean if we really centered what the work is of district leaders, of school leaders, of state policymakers, and then let's build a system that gets them different forms of information when they need it for those kinds of decisions and how decision-making unfolds. I actually think we would have a pretty different looking R&D infrastructure set up than where our current system is. And then I think the current system does enable more of this conversation of we need to just translate it. We just need it to be a 2-page brief and then people will access it. But you're not really hitting on those other kinds of realities of what actually it means to be in making decisions on a day-to-day basis, having to balance all these other kinds of concerns and issues and doing that in ways that it's very rare that it's a single leader making a single decision where there's one piece of research that will magically solve that answer, right? It's usually groups of people, again, spread over time. So, so I think there's also just a little bit of a disconnect currently between what our current setup is, which privileges this one way and then supports this idea of translation. That's all we need to do is just translate it better. But actually, if we start with the idea that, research use is social, it's interactive, it's people making sense of new information and applying it in their context, then you start to see why one strategy like a partnership might be better situated to support that kind of work than the idea of a single decision maker making a decision on Mondays that there's that perfect piece of evidence that they just don't have yet.
That's such a great segue to my last question, which you've already started to kind of go into, Caitlin. But for folks who are interested in RPPs, whether it's a practitioner or a researcher or a researcher practitioner, what would be your recommendations? We've talked a lot about RPPs, some of the challenges, some of the work that happens. What would you say if I was a person who was interested in RPP, which maybe I am? What would you say I should be paying attention to? Where should I start?
Well, you know what I'm going to say. I say, come on down to NERP. We would love to help you.
That's right.
No, in fact, we're launching an RPP 101 series that starts April 2nd. It's an hour over 5 weeks, and we're going to hit different RPP topics. And we'll offer it again. So I know that this podcast is coming out after we've already started that, but we'll offer it again. But I think NERP is obviously I direct NERP, so I'm biased, but I think it's a great starting place for folks. I love talking to people that are interested in doing RPP work all the time. I have these kind of tell me what an RPP is conversations all the time. And they're my favorite because it's a lot of sense making together. Like, you actually might be doing RPPs right now and you didn't necessarily call it that. And so it's a little bit about discovering what happens after you start calling it an RPP, right? Different kinds of ideas or resources might open up to you, kind of like unlock a new way of thinking about the work that you might have already been engaged in. We also have resources on our website that we encourage people to check out. There's one in particular that is a NERP developed resource. It's called Milestones, RPP Milestones, and in it, it's a set of milestones, quote unquote, that NERP members came together to identify over kind of the first 1 to 3 years you're in a partnership. Here are some things you should worry about. Here are some things that, it's all right if you're not really doing that right now. And here are some things that, would be good to focus on, like for sure you need to do these things. So that's another kind of resource to start. And then I think a third thing that I would just say is I would encourage people to start really small and then start smaller. So RPPs to me start with a simple conversation. And oftentimes the way into partnership is via a research practice project. So you can take a single project and ground that and build off of that until eventually it becomes a quote larger capital R, capital P partnership. And by small, I mean things as simple as like if you're a researcher, Chris, right, in your community, read the local newspaper, go to your local school board meetings, or catch them online later. Go to different spaces in your community where kind of education topics that you have an interest in are happening. Get to know people, introduce yourself. Hi, I'm Chris. I'm really interested in XYZ, and I'd love to hear more about the efforts here that you're hosting in this event, right? I think one phrase that I've heard my colleague Nicole Patentary at Florida State University say over and over again is you got to show up. You got to show up. From a research side, you just got to show up. So that's sort of like one tip if you're a research side person is really show up in these spaces. From a practice side perspective, you have limited time, right? You're doing your job. Like you've got stuff going on there. There might be like, there's 1,000 things going on and there's never enough time, I feel like, for our practice side friends. So in that case, it's a little bit more like, I would maybe suggest more kind of internal reflection about what are some things that if we had research on XYZ, it might be helpful for us to know. And in that case, then you can start to strategize around if there are different local researchers that you might want to reach out to ask or to start a conversation. Again, it's all very small. Caitlin, what do you think?
Yeah, I wrote down all sorts of ideas as you were talking. I mean, I think one would be if you're, a grad student or a postdoc or even early on the research in the research space, early career, like the current, again, you might have found yourself at a school or with a mentor or an advisor who does this kind of work, in which case your program, you'll be able to have those learning opportunities to apprentice into a partnership. Like there are skills, knowledge, dispositions, like things to know about engaging in a partnership that, in being in a learning space, so if you are going into a program and you think that might be what you are interested in doing or how you want to do your research, like I think taking that into account as you're doing your applications and you're talking about, how do you do your research? Who are the local community members, or, and see, just in the same way you might ask about other kinds of questions. I think there will be some places where you have more institutional support or that kind of apprenticeship opportunity. You might find yourself in an institution where it is traditional. And so then your job is to try and go and find your people, like network to find to NERP. You're a graduate student who's curious and come to some of the NERP brown bags, or at AERA if you're in education, like find partnership and also just to name, like you have research practice partnerships, and there's also these other sometimes overlapping fields of youth participatory action research or solidarity co-design or improvement science, like all of these. And some might use the same name of research practice partnerships, but some might not. So, it's kind of about finding what conversation you want to be a part of and who your people are, and going to some of those spaces. For maybe those further along in careers, like, thinking about, are there current projects where you've worked with practice or community members and you actually you have a relationship, some kind of relationship that's been established? You might have the seeds there for something. Like, you'd have to really think and carefully about how you're going to pivot toward a more practice or a partnership model. But a really core important part of the partnership work is around the trust and building relationships. And so if you have some of that already in other projects, how you might be able to move into that in a different way. The last thing for the researchers, to build off of your point, Paula, of like, show up. A great place to go is like a professional association conference. So here's where you have, you're going to the Council of Great Cities Schools conference because there's district leaders and educators there. Like, listen, learn from what are the kinds of issues people are talking about. How could you be in service, or how could your work be in service of those really practical, type of questions? And again, like, keep showing up, being of use, and what are those small P projects. For the practice side, like, especially those who are sitting in a district setting or in a state education agency. And I would not expect that, like, your whole portfolio of research projects would, all of a sudden, shift to partnership work, because it can take a lot of time and you're having to invest in one another as people as you're navigating all of this. But if there are those places where you could move from something more traditional because it makes sense given the issue, because you want to bring more or different diverse perspectives to the table, how could you take what's already in place or some of those initial relationships and potentially go deeper, or to try and build those connections, as Paula was saying. Oh, we have this really pressing issue related to some, like, really tricky school finance issues that we're having. Like, who is someone who might be able to help us, who would, like, bring that, oh, this Chris character we need to bring, like, it would be a value there. So I think there's also a little bit of, like, maybe empowering practice side, community side to ask more of their, like, possible research partners, and for everyone to also, move in with some humility, because, again, typically these are not the roles that we think of or that we've been trained for. So, let's assume that when you're getting started, that there will be conflict and there will be bumps and there are going to be misunderstandings. Let's just take that. Let's just assume that that's going to happen. How can we take it in order to go deeper and to hear other people's perspectives and understand them better and their context better in order to keep the work moving forward? So it's, I can speak for myself. I'm happy to be of use for anyone on the podcast. And I know Paula had mentioned about NERP being another good resource. There is a network of early career folks. Reshape is for, I think, more graduate student postdoc, really focused on developing a network to support early career scholar folks. Would be another resource potentially for that particular group.
Thank you, Drs. Arce-Trigatti and Farrell, for being on this month's podcast. As always, we hope you're safe and healthy. And remember, for the latest analysis on education policy, you should subscribe to the NEPC newsletter at nepc.colorado.edu.